It's probably true in your business as well. When you start out, people are saying, is it a good idea? And, are you qualified to make it? So the more experience you get, the less they're saying, are you qualified to make it? They're just saying, is it a good idea? And a good idea can mean different things to different people. It fits our programming slate. It's something I want to get behind. It has, views I want to promote. The thing is, rejection is the currency of the realm in Hollywood. Anyone who spends any time in Hollywood will tell you that. Even worse for actors. I mean, actors is being rejected on their physicality. They're too tall, they're not tall enough, they're too blonde, they're not blonde enough. I mean, it's really, really brutal out there for actors. And I think it's true for filmmakers, too. There's a lot of rejection out there, and, you just have to get up and, dust off your shirt and go back to fight another day. I mean, just about everyone I know deals with it. I mean, I know some very well-known people who, it's tough. I mean, they're completely getting beat up in the comments. I mean, you can be at the top of the game, and people can be just absolutely vicious in reviews and comments and online, and even just getting the projects going. I mean, so you have to really have a passion for it. Otherwise, you shouldn't be doing it, because you really have to have passion to getting up there and fighting. There are a lot easier ways to make a living.
Welcome to Curiosity Podcast, where we go deep on a wide variety of technical topics with the smartest leaders in the world. I'm Immad and Raj, co-founder and CEO of Mercury.
And I'm Raj Suri, co-founder of Lima, Presto, and Lyft. And today we're going to talk with Bill Guttentag, who is the Oscar-winning writer, director, and producer, best known for You Don't Have to Die, Nanking, and Crime and Punishment. He is also a lecturer at Stanford, who has been lecturing for several years. And he's here today to talk about how filmmaking has evolved through the years, how technology is being integrated into filmmaking, and just the overall creative process of making films. Immad, what are you curious to talk to Bill about?
I don't know that much about filmmaking, so I think even some of the basics, like how did he get into it, what's the process? Often people compare kind of startups to filmmaking. Want to discuss that and see like where the similarities are and where they end.
Absolutely. I am fascinated with film, as it's like, you're trying to build this almost perfect product because it lasts forever. You can't iterate, right? You have to put together the product, under these, very significant constraints. And it's very people driven as well, which is similar to startups. It's also very technology driven, and the industry itself changes a lot.
It's also a bit more ephemeral in nature, right? Like a startup you could do for decades, whereas a film you do and then you move on from the project. So it's interesting.
It's ephemeral for you, but it could last forever from the audience perspective. Like we're still talking about films made, 70 years ago.
30 years ago.
And I think, Steve Jobs talked about this as like the difference between his work at Pixar and the different, in Apple, right? Like in Apple, his work is constantly being obsolete. I like the kind of juxtaposition between the two. Like at one side, you're making things that last forever. On the other side, you're on the bleeding edge and you're advancing the whole industry and humanity in some way with tech. So, anyways, it'll be fascinating to talk to Bill because he's actually on the intersection of both. Given he is at Stanford, he actually sees tech quite often, and he knows how to explain film really well as well. So, excited to have him on the show. Welcome, Bill.
Okay, well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to have you. Filmmaking is obviously an unusual profession. How did you initially get into it?
Well, I started in high school, and then I studied it in college, and then I went to film school. And after film school, like everyone, I sort of struggled to get ahead and managed to get a job, and just built on it from there.
What was your kind of first kind of break into it?
I think the first major thing that I had done was I wrote a treatment for an HBO documentary, and I was HBO bought the documentary, and I was sort of underqualified, but I got a low-level job on the film, and that job. I ended up producing about 40% of the film due to some unusual circumstances. And at that point, I went from being someone that HBO had never heard of to someone who had produced about 40% of film they liked. and that made it a lot easier to get further work. And I did a bunch of HBO films from there.
You said you did a treatment on it. What does that mean?
Well, an executive at HBO had approached a director I was friends with and said, well, I think this would be a good idea for a film, and that they kick loose a relatively small amount of money and you do the research. I mean, I still do this on films now, where you develop a film and you spend a relatively small amount of money, and the idea is that, well, let's see if there's a film here. And if you don't feel like if there's a film protects both you and the network, if you do feel like there's a film, you go forward. I mean, making films is, inherently a risky situation. It's a little like playing pool. There's no guarantee that the ball's going to go in the pocket, but you do everything you can to try to line up the shot as best you can.
It's a little bit like a prototype, Immad. It's like they kind of like write a script, right? Yeah. Like you do a mock-ups or something.
Yeah.
I wonder how many startup analogies we're going to do in this podcast.
Yeah. Well, that is true. It's a short thing, and especially documentaries. You don't really know where it's going to go, and it helps alleviate the risk a bit. It de-risks it, and it protects both the filmmaker and the network.
Yeah, you've done mostly documentaries. Is that like a particular passion?
I've done documentaries and I've done fictional films. Most of the fictional films I've done have been related to true stories. I'm very interested in true stories. I find it completely fascinating. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm always looking for good stories.
Yeah. What is it about documentaries that like kind of gets you so excited?
Well, I find true stories of people's lives really, really interesting. So there's a writer which I really admired when I was in college called Studs Terkel. He's like an old school radio guy. And his whole theory was everyone has an interesting story. So if you're at Stanford where I teach, the president of Stanford has a great story. The person who's driving the bus has a great story. The Nobel Prize winning professor's got a great story. The woman who's working in the cafeteria has a great story. I mean, people's stories are profoundly interesting. And so Studs Terkel wrote a book called Working, and also one called The Good War, among others. And those are the two I like the most. So I always felt like, people have good stories. And the other thing I like about doing it is that in some ways you're in a privileged situation. People are sharing their stories with you. There are these horrifying stats out there about how much real time, that parents speak to children, boyfriends speak to girlfriends, boyfriends and girlfriends, just, the relationships in our lives, the amount of real time folks speak is very small. It's just shockingly small. So when you do a documentary, you set up a camera, you create an environment where people can often go back to the most important time in their life and spend 90 minutes, a couple hours. It can be really profound. You're asking people their life stories. And I found this with, people who are really well known and people who are not well known. I've always found it interesting doing both foot soldiers and generals.
How do you get people to open up? It seems like that's a hard skill.
Well, I think most people want to open up on some level, but just the day-to-day buzzing around makes it difficult. So, that's why in some ways there's just so little conversation between people. I mean, I can tell you a story where years ago I interviewed the civil rights legend, John Lewis, who is quite famous. If you look at the footage of the bridge at Selma, he's the first person in line getting his head bashed in. He was, at the March on Washington. He was friends with Martin Luther King Jr., just a congressman, just an extraordinary guy. And when I went to interview him, he had promised us like half an hour because he's an extremely busy guy. And we set up, and the lighting is beautiful. The camera person I used does the Ken Burns films, if you know that look. And we just started going through his life, and it was really, really moving. It's, so half an hour became an hour, became, an hour and a half, became 2 hours, became 2.5 hours. And at the end of it, he was crying, the camera person was crying, I was crying. It was a very emotional experience, to just go back, spend 2.5 hours, go over this important time of your life. And after we finished, the lights came on. I guess we all dried our tears. And he sat around, we just sat around schmoozing for half an hour, without the camera on. I mean, it's just really, you're affording people the opportunity to tell their story. And most people, I believe, want to tell their story, but they're not afforded the opportunity to do it.
Do you find there's any kind of particular questions that you ask that really are incisive?
Well, I think I'm looking to ask people questions that'll elicit thoughtful and or emotional responses. I mean, a lot of times just a resuscitation of the facts or, it's not that interesting. I mean, often you need it. You need it as connective tissue, in a documentary. You need the resuscitation of the facts. But, it's a lot more important about, how you felt as you were doing this. And, and there's, part of doing a documentary takes you to all sorts of places. I mean, you go quite literally all over the world. One of the people here is Buzz Aldrin, so it's even out of the current world, and you're asking him, hey, what's it like looking back at Earth? So it's, it's really broadens you. And you, I can't tell you how many times I've done lengthy interviews with folks and they have thanked me. I'm like, thank you. You took a big chunk of your day out of this. I'm incredibly grateful. And they're, well, thank you. It was really meaningful to me. So I think in that way it can be a great reciprocal experience.
Yeah, Bill, this has been your entire career making films. You also teach, right, at Stanford?
Right. I mean, I have sort of two things I do more than anything else, which is I've been making films and I've been teaching at the Stanford Graduate School of Business since 2001. I've also taught at the Stanford Design School as well.
I mean, they're very different, right? One is very creative. The other one is more, coaching and mentoring. How do you balance those two?
By the way, I have amazing students and, based where I am here in Silicon Valley, I can't tell you how often students come to me and say, I have this idea, and I say, wow, that's a really good idea. And some of these have become, viable and really good companies. And I think, there's a line that, I've heard said, which resonated with me, where it's, I never fail to learn from my students. So I find it a really rewarding experience to be around the students. I think that they ask really good questions, and sometimes of me, sometimes I have guests. And I think that it really, helps keep you sharp, being around the students. And tracking the entertainment business is something that changes quite a bit. I'm sure you're very aware. The class I'm teaching now, in some ways, very different than the class I taught 5 years ago or 10 years ago. The readings are completely different. Everything changes, when you're in the entertainment world. I mean, just look back 5 or 10 years, think about that. If you're looking about where we're sitting right now, I meet with a lot of students. A lot of students have projects. They have companies, which I sometimes advise on, sometimes formally, sometimes informally. And if you're just looking at the trends where we're sitting right now, everything has to do with AI. And, I don't think that's that much different than a lot of Silicon Valley at this point, but you're dealing with very sharp students who are trying to think about how is this going to be used and in what ways.
That's fascinating. You mentioned that, nowadays programmers, especially young programmers, are becoming AI native, where they build programs along with an AI copilot, and more senior programmers are not used to that, so it's very strange for them to do that. So you're seeing this trend of new programmers becoming very productive and efficient, compared to even more more experienced programmers. Are you seeing something similar in the filmmaking or are you seeing that trend starting to emerge where younger filmmakers are more using the tools that AI gives them and are able to have superpowers as a result?
Well, this is a really big question, but one thing I think I just want to address your earlier point, Raj, that I think a lot of folks around here can be on sort of bleeding edge of what's going on. I mean, I remember, it seems crazy now, but I remember my son came home from school in Palo Alto and said, we learned this, great new technologies in elementary school. I said, well, what's it called? He says, it's called PowerPoint. And it was so new. I said, well, so, what does this PowerPoint do? I was asking, he's telling me about it. He said, yeah, we had a bunch of teachers from Holland come and see how technology is being used around here. This was like an age, it seems crazy now. PowerPoint was like leading technology. But, it has to be tried out first somewhere, and this is before we were all using it. So, and I've always found that interesting. What's happening in AI is now, it's a big debate about what it's going to be able to do. I think a general consensus is on things like for film, like scheduling and that sort of thing, it's complete, it's great. I mean, why not? On special effects, it's really kind of amazing. I mean, a lot of it's already used in all sorts of forms, like, quite a few actresses wear wigs these days, and the wigs that come down low, and there's a line, and you need to track someone walking across the screen, and it can help remove that sort of thing. These kind of effects are being done. If you want to have a fire burning, behind you, that used to be an expensive effect, and now it's like someone who's like a freshman in college can do that, pretty easily. And I think that things like that, you're going to see just a lot of it being used. The real question going forward is, like, how are you going to get deep into the creative space? So if I'm filming, conversation with the three of us around the table, I might use 2 cameras, do 5 or 6 setups when you move the camera someplace else. So 2 cameras, 5 setups, and do 5 takes, right? Well, when you go to cut the scene, that's a lot of takes to choose from. What point, do I go to Immad? What point do I go to Raj? Sometimes, Raj, the line you deliver, you'll have a better facial expression and you'll want to use the voice from another take, or which if sure enough you can get away with, or you cut to a shot of me. This is really a game of inches. Actors will often give different performances on different takes. Not all, some of them are pretty close to each one. And then as a director, you decide which one works best. Again, this is inches. Also, how do you, in terms of the writing, how are you going to do the writing? I mean, right now the writing is not very good. I mean, it doesn't mean that in 5 years it won't be good. And there's ethical issues that are involving this too, where you can, especially if you go international countries, extras can be much less, it just costs less to hire an extra for a day. So if you hire an extra and they sign a release to you, are you going to be able to use them, forever? I mean, these are like, sort of ethical questions that come into play a lot, and I think it's going to unfold as we go forward, of course.
It seems to me that the future of filmmaking is going to be like you have, a great director, you have maybe a very limited number of actors who have maybe signed over their likeness or something to be used for the film. And you just have much fewer people working on the same film to be able to deliver that a great story, right? Because ultimately you're storytelling, and if you have that core story which is really compelling, you could spend $100 million to deliver it. But with the tools that you have, you could probably spend just $1 million or $2 million to deliver that same story quite efficiently and much faster, without dealing with all the scheduling headaches of having to have a cast of, or like a crew of hundreds of people. Do you think that's where filmmaking is going? Do you think like it could be much more efficient teams building great things? Because we're seeing that in technology right now.
Yeah, I think that's certainly going to be the case. So you'll have smaller teams. There is a core number that you need, but things like special effects for sure, and the scheduling for sure. When you're actually filming on a set, there's a certain basic number you need to get a look that's good. I mean, of course, in things like animation and animated features, it's gonna have a big effect as well. So yeah, it will make things efficient, but at least in the near future, I can't see the major qualities that make you want to see a movie being replaced by AI. By the way, people have been talking about this for years. I mean, every year there's a study that they've broken the code on movies. We can predict what's going to be a hit. Look, if they had broken the code, every movie would be a hit. It's just like, this is a little bit of a fantasy that, you can somehow break the code of what creates a hit.
I think movies in the cinema are like the furthest and hardest to replace. Like I have, my 7-year-old sometimes ends up on these YouTube videos that are just purely AI done. I mean, they're awful. I'm like banning YouTube, partly because these videos exist, but like they're literally like 100% AI generated. I think the text is probably AI as well. Like one person created it, and there's millions of these on YouTube now. So I think that's like the most creativity in the bottom end. Well, the most AI usage will be at the bottom end initially, and then it will creep upwards, I guess.
Well, there's always a lot of like stuff out there, and like how do you separate out? I mean, I mentioned that I've been an advisor to a number of companies. One of the companies I was advisor to is Masterclass, and I directed their first and third class, and one of the third one we did was with Serena Williams, who's was the world's leading tennis player at the time. And the question, before we went and filmed the class with Serena Williams, I personally was watching a lot of tennis out there on YouTube. Man, the whole world was awash in tennis lessons on YouTube. But then, I think the folks who founded Masterclass very wisely asked, well, how do we be different? Just because it's there doesn't mean it's good. And I think they endeavor to make it, first rate. And I think you have a lot of that. There's just a lot of stuff out there. It doesn't mean it's good stuff. There's just a lot of stuff.
I guess I have two questions that are related. Number one, startup fundraising and like success is kind of this like probability game where someone has a good pitch, they get funded to seed, and they have some metrics they prove, and then they get funded beyond that, and obviously eventually they hit like the nirvana of a unicorn or whatever. How do you compare that to the steps to like producing a film?
There are similarities. I mean, that's certainly true. That in a way, what is a startup? I mean, a startup is you hope a good idea, you hope a good team, you hope the proper funding, and you hope you create a product that people will use or like, right? So that's the same thing for film. You have you hope you have a good idea, a script, or in a documentary case, a treatment. You put together a good team. You hope you have the appropriate funding, and in the end, you hope you make a good product. So yeah, there are a lot of similarities, to doing it. And look, there is this kind of overlap of a lot of stuff in Silicon Valley and a lot of stuff in Hollywood. But I think, Silicon Valley, is very interested in data. I mean, that's obviously no secret. But, I have in my class one speaker after another that says they don't use data in making their programming decisions. I recently had the former CEO of HBO who listed all of the classic HBO shows recently, Game of Thrones and Veep and you name it, the Succession, all these really impressive shows. And he asked my students, how much data you think was used in doing all these shows, all the classic HBO shows? And the answer was none, zero. There was zero testing on any of those. So it's still a business where you're relying on the creativity, and it's a chance. I mean, by the way, it's well-known story. In Game of Thrones, which arguably, one of the most successful TV series ever made, they thought they had a good series. They went out and they filmed Game of Thrones, and when HBO looked at the pilot, they thought it could be better, and they reshot the pilot for Game of Thrones. Again, these are the kind of sort of executive decisions that data is not influencing. This is just, we think we have a good show, let's put some money into it. And again, like Game of Thrones, same deal. It's sort of like a startup, right? If they had stopped in the pilot that, wasn't so great, then, it would have been a busted pilot. It would have busted startup that didn't yield anything.
I feel like Netflix has like a lot of shows that have like, I don't know if they use data to decide to do the show, but they seem to have these patterns that they repeat. It's like, oh, this is a teenage drama. This is a. Well,
look, they're trying to get people to watch. I mean, it's not just Netflix, it's everyone else. There's certain categories that deliver. I mean, sometimes shows deliver things other than, other than ratings. They're important shows to have on your network. I mean, they always said that about Girls. Girls always had low ratings on HBO, but it was an important show for them to have. So yeah, the name of the game is to get people to watch. Sure, it's a very competitive space out there, especially now. I mean, it's just so.
Why was it important?
Well, because it was important to their profile. It was an innovative show, and the audience that they were going for. Yeah, I think that
It's a brand value.
Yeah, it also it was an award show. I mean, a lot of the shows are award shows, and awards can help your network and help you attract other filmmakers.
So strategic value. Yeah, got it.
Yeah, strategic value. I mean, you're running a portfolio. I mean, no one's ever looking to lose money. I mean, no one ever puts on a Broadway show and hopes no one shows up. I mean, it's you're always looking to gather an audience, but how do you define success? I mean, this is also something that film does. Film can have a great influence in the social space. So the effect isn't just how many people, what's your box office? It's like, how do you influence the conversation?
Is there a power law distribution in success, like in the sense that if you do 10, one of them makes most of the money?
Yeah, I mean, it's still a hit-driven business. I mean, it's like books are a hit-driven business too. Most books don't make money, and then there's some books that pay back their advances, and everyone's looking for, the big bestseller. I think that's true in film. It's like the metrics are a little bit tougher when you're dealing with the streamers. Like, how are you actually defining it? And it's a little tougher than a theatrical release, right? In some ways, Netflix has the simplest business model of all of them, right? I mean, Netflix is overwhelmingly just selling programming and, subscriptions. And, do you like it or do you not like it? Do you renew? Do you not renew? I mean, they're not in all sorts of other areas.
In the sense that I think they do release things to the cinema and stuff like that, right? What do you mean they're not in other areas?
They release it for award consideration, but it's not really their core business. And it also attracts filmmakers. I mean, filmmakers like seeing films on big screens. A lot of times, a lot of the really beautiful stuff that you see on Netflix or Amazon or elsewhere, it's stuff that's shot on big screens. It's for the big screen. It's really beautifully shot. So they'll release it in theaters for a limited period of time. I mean, there's also issues of cannibalization, on that. But once it goes into theaters, then it's eligible for some sort of award consideration. Then they can promote it for the awards, and it's a cycle that keeps going. Yeah.
What do you think the future is of big screen movies? There's a lot of speculation there.
It's a really good question, Raj. I think one of the negative effects of COVID is, as we come out of it, is that it's getting increasingly hard for small or mid-budget films to find a theatrical home. It's there's just the movie theaters are becoming spectacle movie operations, and I think that's really that's too bad. So we'll see if we recover. Sometimes things will break through, and we'll recover for it. But right now, we're dealing with the big spectacle movies, and even that has its own issues, because folks are getting tired of a lot of the tentpole movies. I mean, it's been a tough year for Marvel and others. People are just tired of it. And that's just in the U.S. I mean, if you start looking internationally, in China, the trend's been going on for a long time that the Chinese are, audience is much less interested in these big Marvel movies.
Yeah, it strikes me that the movie theater may go the way of the drive-in. It was like a cool experience at some point, but it's now it's going to become at some point nostalgia. You go to a movie theater.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be there. Look, that's the hope. You don't want it to become the drive-in or opera or any of these sort of very niche places, but there's still people want to go out on dates. They want to get out of their house. There's still movies that are shot. I mean, my experience of working on films is people take it really seriously. They take the art of it really seriously, the cinematography really seriously, the art direction. They treat there's like movies, which are different sometimes than series. So look, some series are truly spectacular. They look like a movie, but There's also series that look a lot less spectacular, but the movies, people put a lot of care into it, and I think there's always going to be a home for it. It may be a reduced home, and I hope not too reduced.
You've done various roles in movies, producer, director, writer. What is your favorite? What are the different things you get out of the different roles you've been involved in?
Well, it's a really good question. Films are considered being written 3 times. For a narrative film, it's when you write the script or someone writes a script, then you direct it, and then you go into the edit room. So these are 3 very different parts of the process. And directors have the most say, of course, in the latter 2. And there's a lot of directors that say they only go through the first 2 parts so they can get to the 3rd part. It's and so they just love being in the editing room, and I think I love all the parts, but I think I'm a bit in that category. If you think about it, when you're directing a film, it's very public. There's a lot of people on a set, and it's a very public experience, and you're a leader of a team. You don't do these things yourself, but you and the heads of departments, the cinematographer, and the makeup person, and the production designer, and so on, are all sort of working together, and you hope working together well. But it's very public. There's a lot of people out there, and and it's one of the things I'm impressed by actors. They're out there, the camera's in their face, and they're being asked to be very vulnerable. And there's 100 people standing around, and so actually sometimes a lot more than that. And then when you get in the edit room, it's almost like you can sort of try things and fail, and the cost is not that much. When you get into edit room, it's yourself as director and editor, an assistant editor, and sometimes an apprentice editor. It's really a small group, and you're just trying things. And can you change it? And sometimes I look at a scene and I have it's not working, and I think a good idea. Let's cut this shot. Let's move this shot over here. How about if we shave 4 or 6 frames off this shot, and maybe that'll do it. And then there's other times you just say it's not working. I have no idea, and you're just trying to figure out why this scene is not working, and you just try different iterations, and you're failing, and hopefully at some point you succeed. So you're really writing the film at that point. And by the way, you're also writing the film when you're mixing the film and coloring the film. So there's a lot of stuff that happens after the filming ends, which I think is really important. I really like. But as I said, I like all the parts.
Is there ever a moment where you're like, oh, we need to reshoot this? Like you kind of step backwards, or...
By the way, this is when you really rely on your team. You don't do things by yourself. I want to emphasize this over and over and over again. This is the most collaborative art form ever done. To your point, when you're shooting, you're thinking about that. You don't want to be the person, you don't want to be sitting in the editing room and say, who's the idiot that didn't get that close up? And you realize, oh, that idiot was me. So while you're shooting, you do this. I had a scene on a film I did recently that we were shooting in the desert, and cameras went down for about an hour, which almost never happened. Only time it happened. But the desert can be really hard on cameras. And we didn't get a close up. And it was on a Friday. And over the weekend, I was talking with the editor a lot and saying, do we need to get the close-up? Can you cut the scene without this close-up? It was a car scene, and it's a woman in the back seat of a car. And we talked about it. And, to go back there, you have to move you got to move, like in our case, 130-person crew just to get a close-up. When you're actually filming, it's a very small group, but, the whole army has to move to do it. And, and she said to me, look, Bill, I think we really need it, and that becomes a financial decision. And we went back and we got it. The actual filming took 15 minutes, but the setting up took, vastly more. And this is how you depend on your team. And, and so to your point, we really need that close up. We would have gotten it if not for the cameras going down. But, these are decisions you make, and you rely on your team, and you want to make sure that by the time you show up in the editing room, you have what you need.
Yeah. How do you decide between, and this is a thing that comes up often at Mercury, so you could ship it, but the quality wouldn't be good, right? Like it would be missing this close up. Versus, you stay on budget, you do it quickly, etc. Like, do you always go for the quality? Like, you always keep a standard?
This is the big question. I mean, they always say films are not finished; they're abandoned. So, so it's like how much do you do? Yeah, I mean, I mean the most important thing you have on any TV series or film is time. So how do you budget your time? I mean, if you have all the time in the world, you can get everything you want. You show up in an editing room and, you can have that shot of of a coffee cup on your thing, 10 different ways, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. But, in the real world, if you need to close up someone, take a cup, you're going to get it and you're going to move on. You're constantly doing that. I mean, films, at least the ones I'm involved with and the way it should be run, they're run on a budget. So you try to shoot a certain amount each day, and you really try to make your days to get that. So you're constantly asking budget questions. This is also the trade-offs that you get when you're making films, that producers will say to directors, "Do you want this or do you want that?" You just can't keep increasing the budget, but maybe if you combine these two locations, like you can say, well, you have two bar scenes. Well, let's go to one bar and we'll shoot looking one way, and then we'll, turn the sports bar into a tiki bar by just doing the art direction and changing out the furniture, and then you're not doing, what's called company move. You still have to spend the time filming it, but if you're driving, your whole operation one place. Yeah, I mean, these are the kind of things that happen all the time that you're just trying to figure out how do I save money.
Do you think films do better when they do have constraints, right? Like, presumably, like a big Marvel movie or something doesn't have much of a constraint.
I think Marvel movies have constraints. I mean, they're a lot looser. I think that constraints can help you. They can engender the creativity. You're trying to think, how can I do this in this period of time? But don't forget, it is so creative and it is so collaborative that you're working with other folks. You're not doing it by yourself. So if someone is saying to you, look, we have to cut a couple of days from your schedule, then you got to figure out how you're going to do it. Sometimes it's in the writing, sometimes it's in the filming. Sometimes you're asking yourself, do I really need the scene? I mean, it forces you to keep asking questions.
Bill, can you talk about some of your recent work? Are you interested in talking about?
So I recently completed a film called Afghan Dreamers, which is based on the true story of the Afghan girls robotics team. And it's really a fascinating experience to get out there, and we're making a film about a true story. I mean, anyone can look up the story. It was in the news quite a bit. And we're basically a 2-hour ad for Girls in STEM, but the story is also incredibly inspiring, and especially given what's going on in Afghanistan now. So,
yeah, absolutely, it sounds fascinating. And so, tell me a little bit about like your creative process. I'm curious about, it's very sort of like project based, right? Like. Immad and I are founders. We start a company that could be a decades-long initiative, but like, for you, how do you come up with your ideas? What's your process like? Do you have multiple things kind of in parallel? I'm curious how that creative process works for you.
Yeah, well, I think most folks like me have multiple ideas going, and you're never really sure when they're going to go. Different factors can actually turn something into sort of an idea, into a project that's happening. You're also, again, I can speak for myself and some of the friends I know who are directors and writers in the business. It takes years to make a film, so you better like the film that you're doing, and you better think it's going to do some good out there. Otherwise, why are you spending years of your life on this? So, it's often a pretty intense commitment. I often, do films based on true stories, so I often get close to the people who it's about. When I do documentaries, of course, those are true stories, and I often get close to the people that those are about. So there's an emotional connection that comes with a lot of this. And ultimately you're asking, is this going to be a good film or not, or a good series? I've done TV series too. in a movie, people are giving you roughly 2 hours of their lives, which they're never going to see again. So, and it's a lot more for a series and obviously vastly more in a video game. But, what are you going to give them back for that time? So you have to feel like you're giving somebody something for that 2 hours for a movie, and it should be something worthwhile. So I'm always asking, is this a worthwhile project? And then once you do it, it's all like a startup. Okay, well, you think it's a good idea. Who's the team that's going to help you make it? And for the projects which a lot of the projects which I do, often that they're lower budget operations, but you try to sort of cast and have people in them that are above your budget level. So you're asking people to essentially back your vision because they believe it. I mean, the film I just mentioned, Afghan Dreamers, we have like 3 songs from will.i.am in there, and he's a big believer in supporting robotics competitions and kids, and that's, I think, pretty typical, is that people just want to help. I mean, look, there's other situations where people are they're not looking to help, but on the kind of films I do, I'm always amazed and grateful for how much people want to contribute to them.
How do you come up with your ideas? Like, do you read this like in the news and like you say, okay, this could be a great story? Yeah,
it can come from anywhere. I mean, I just think that we're surrounded by good stories, but then is there practical stories? Can you make the story? Is it is someone going to fund it? I mean, if you're a filmmaker, you're always out there looking for funds, and there are a variety of places you can go, but you have an idea, and sometimes it's just sort of a very general idea, and then it becomes a specific idea. And okay, well, you have this specific idea. Well, who are you going to get to fund it? And that can be a whole project involved. I mean, sometimes you get lucky and you get more than one person who wants to fund it. So yeah, I mean, so it has to be a good idea, and it has to be something that's fundable, and also feel like you have to make something people want to see. I mean, sometimes I hear people say, "Oh, I only want to make this film for myself," and when I hear that, I feel like saying, "Well, then don't show it to me." I mean, we all have limited time, so give somebody something of value for the time that they have. I mean, there's still something great about the collective experience of watching a film in a theater or coming in, and I have this often in my classes where if there'll be a show that's really in the zeitgeist, the way Succession was fairly recently, I think there's something great about your crowd of friends, and in my case students, watching this show and talking about it, and there's something real there, and I think that it's real value.
Do you sometimes have an idea that you think would work, but you have a hard time like persuading anyone to fund it? And like, how do you like de-risk it or like convince them that it'll be good?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, you try to de-risk it. I mean, I think for any filmmakers, or it's probably true in your business as well. When you start out, people are saying, "Is it a good idea?" And are you qualified to make it? So the more experience you get, the less they're saying, "Are you qualified to make it?" They're just saying, "Is it a good idea?" And a good idea can mean different things to different people. It fits our programming slate. It's something I want to get behind. It has, views I want to promote. But yeah, you're always looking to do this. I mean, the thing is, rejection is the currency of the realm in Hollywood. Anyone who spends any time in Hollywood will tell you that. I mean, it's full of rejection, and you have to, I mean, it's even worse for actors. I mean, actors is, I think just exceptionally hard, because a lot of times actors are being rejected on their physicality. They're too tall, they're not tall enough, they're too blonde, they're not blonde enough. I mean, it's really, really brutal out there for actors. And I think it's true for filmmakers too. There's a lot of rejection out there, and you just have to get up and dust off your shirt and go back to fight another day. I mean, just about everyone I know deals with it. I mean, I know some very well-known people who, it's tough. I mean, they're completely getting beat up in the comments. I mean, you can be at the top of the game, and people can be just absolutely vicious in reviews and comments and online, and even just getting the projects going. I mean, so you have to really have a passion for it. Otherwise, you shouldn't be doing it, because you really have to have passion to getting up there and fighting. There are a lot easier ways to make a living.
Yeah. Any other methods in dealing with rejection? You talked about like getting up again, having passion.
I think President Obama had this line, which I thought was great, where he said, let the highs get you too high and the lows get you too lows. When they're calling you a genius, they're probably exaggerating. When they're calling you an utter idiot, they're probably exaggerating too. You just have to have some feeling that you're making a contribution here, and it's got some value.
One last question I have, Bill, because I know we're almost out of time here. Do you have a community of other directors and creators that you exchange ideas with, you collaborate with? In tech, we actually have Immad and I are part of a couple of groups where we talk about things and we bounce things off each other, and we challenge each other too to do better and improve our mental models. Is that community there in film as well?
Of course. Yeah, you send scripts to people, you send cuts to people, you really value their feedback. I mean, a lot of times you'll have friends and you have a screening for friends and family, and you're specifically looking for feedback. You want people to tell you things, and you want to listen to the crowd of people you respect. Because you can get in a place where you're not seeing them. It's that sort of old saw where, if I'm walking through Stanford campus and I bump into a student and says, "Bill, I can't believe it's 11 o'clock and you're drunk." He said, "Well, I didn't have anything to drink." And then you go into a coffee shop, another student says, "Bill, here it is. You've been drinking already." You say, "No, I had nothing to drink." And if you bump into a third student who says, "Why are you drinking?" And you say, "Well, at that point, you're probably drunk." It's like you have to listen to, you have to listen to what people say to you. And if you have enough people saying it to you, a lot of times it's often valid. I mean, this is part of, I assume, like you guys are founders. I assume it's like part of being a boss is, you're looking at cuts. It's very subjective. You can make changes. You can not make changes. If you're getting pressure, sometimes, you stick with your vision and you're saying, well, even if, the editor and everyone else is saying I need to change it, I'm not going to change it. But I have to say far more often, if your editor is saying it and your friends are saying it, you have to change something, then far more often, then that's probably should be changed. Also, sometimes, again, I don't know if this is analogous to tech, sometimes people will have a problem with something, but that's not really the problem. They're bumping up against it, but they're really bumping up against something else. But, then you have to figure out what they're bumping up against. But, to your point, I mean, I think it's so valuable to have friends that you can share things with. And it's one that actually, I feel like, I've said some stuff that's, not so great about the film business. One of the things that's actually kind of really nice about the film business, people like watching movies. So it's easy to assemble people to do it. I've read a couple of books, trying to get your friends to read a 300-page book, a lot tougher.
If you were a young filmmaker, what would you recommend in terms of building a community of kind of like-minded people?
I had the advantage of going to film school. Look, I still work with people I went to school with, but you want to develop a supportive community that you can really trust. It can be people in the film business, it can be people outside the film business, but you want people who will support you. And by the way, this is just not my story. It's the story of just about everybody I know feels this way, that you want a team, not team, but a group of people who can, tell you what they really think. I mean, a lot of times, sometimes I send a film someone I'm not as close with, and they say, look, I'm going to tell you the truth. And you're just like, well, that's exactly what I want you to do. You don't want someone to just to say, oh, that's wonderful. You want them to look at it and give you feedback. This scene, I got kind of bored here, or, I didn't quite understand this character's motivation, and you want to address anything that you can do to make it stronger. As I said before, films aren't finished; they're abandoned. So you want to feel like before you abandon it, you've done everything you can to make it great.
Yeah. So is there a big loop between like editing, getting people to listen, watch it, and then going back to editing? That must happen a lot.
I mean, you can't do this like on a weekly basis. I mean, it's like, but you want, on a film, you usually want to be far enough down the path that people can feel it, and then you can evaluate. I mean, there's a famous story of Pixar when they did Monsters, Inc., and they had tested it and the film did really well, but they didn't feel like the fur rippled well enough. And I think they shot down for like 4 months to just make the fur ripple. I mean, just because you just want to make it as good as possible. By the way, there's a really good book, which I recommend to my students, called Creativity Inc., which is about the inner workings of Pixar. And it's just an excellent book. And it's all about, how you work as a team. How do you get feedback? At Pixar, they call it a brain trust. People who are going to, give you really good feedback and to how to use it to make for a better film. And I can honestly tell you that every film I've ever done has benefited from the contributions, not of the people making the film, but the people I've shown the film to, in preparation to release the film.
This was great, Bill. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
It's fascinating.
I feel like I want to be a filmmaker now.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you guys are doing really impressive stuff, so.
That was a great discussion, Raj. What were your favorite parts?
I really like just talking about the creative process and like how he comes up with his ideas, and like having a group of people where he gets feedback from. In some ways, as a founder, you can kind of like learn from that process. In some ways, you can't. I mean, one thing is like, they basically roll off after a couple of years, right, of every project. So even when you talked about building a film for years, I mean, still not as long as, we work on our companies. One thing I really like about Bill is that he makes movies that have a social goal in nature. He's not just making pulp, he's actually making some really interesting movies, and he's motivated by contributing to society, which is kind of a cool thing to see from a filmmaker.
Yeah, he's also a very humble, down-to-earth person. Like, even now he's like, trying to get things funded, like worried about rejection, all these things, which like you would think with his success, he would be past all of that, right?
Well, one thing though that like really fascinates me about film versus like tech is like how many great filmmakers there are in their 80s making great movies. Like there's, Ridley Scott, Steven Spielberg. The new Mad Max is about to come out this summer with George Miller, who's an 81-year-old film director. So it's kind of inspiring for us to think about like, hey, you can be creative and high energy up, into your 80s, making stuff that matters.
Yeah, in some ways, I guess it's easier to do that because a lot of it is kind of that individual contribution rather than like you have the team, but like, when you CEO, it's like quite high stress and there's like hundreds of people that like you have to kind of report to.
There is an impression in Silicon Valley sometimes that people who are older and they are less capable of starting companies. I think I've seen that. I've also seen people not hire people. I've seen startups not hire older people, and in my last company we had several people who were considered maybe older than average for a startup, and they did great. I mean, they actually did really well with us, and I felt like it was an untapped pool of talent. So we're talking about something else here, but I generally think in Silicon Valley, like in tech circles, we give up on founders too early. There's no reason why someone can't start a successful company in their 70s. It's something I think about sometimes. So that was just one sort of tangential thought to filmmaking. But Immad, what did you think? What were you interested to learn from Bill?
The one thing that was like really interesting is this idea of kind of craft, and like, there's definitely like an element of like they're trying to get this like emotion and this perfect moment, and there's like lots of these things around like kind of going to that shot in the desert to get like a close up, and get those kind of attention to detail things are like super interesting because when you look at the whole film you might not notice it, but it's like got these like thousands or maybe tens of thousands of like these small attention to detail things that make it like a great film and really pull together that story. And like there's the emotional element to the attention to detail, like and this, like telling the story, getting deep there. I think that's really interesting, and like there's an element of that in like kind of startups and making products. Like you kind of need to have that attention to detail and I think about the user experience. But it's really extreme in kind of filmmaking, which is like purely kind of creative. It's interesting to think about like how one can make products that have that similar kind of concept of craft in them, which we try to do a little bit with Mercury, but it kind of gets you inspired to go like way further when you listen to someone like Bill.
Absolutely. No, that's why I love the craft, and I love the art of filmmaking, but also the experience of watching it. One thing I've always wondered about is why can't films change over time? Like why can't, and now especially with technology, like why can't we adapt Gladiator, with some new scenes, of course we love the film as it was originally, but like I think we also would love it with some new flavors, and so. Like you have fan fiction for books. Yeah, you should have that for movies too. And before it would be too expensive, but now it's probably
Yeah, we
possible.
talked a little bit about AI. In some ways, AI for this kind of state, like, far enough along filmmaking, like, like a real AAA movie, is like very far. But you could imagine in 10 years' time, we could, take Gladiator and like swap out the role for myself or change the ending or like it seems like those things are not like too far away. And that would be kind of interesting, like having kind of a lot of personalization. I think this idea of anyone becoming a filmmaker is also kind of interesting, right? Like there's it seems like there's a lot of luck involved to being successful, being in the right place, going to the right college, and all that kind of stuff. Which, I think in AI could potentially enable like creativity in like a much broader set of people.
Well, great. That was fun. Thank you all for listening to the Curiosity Podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, make sure you subscribe and all that.